Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to look at how to build a simple web application with ReactJS and Django. So what we're going to be building is this simple guestbook application, or call it a note-taking application. Very simple, very basic, and this is actually targeted to beginners. So the first thing we're going to do is to add a post, and we pop up this form that is on a model. So you can be able to add in a title, for example, note 1, and we can be able to add some content. So we can say that this is a note. So when I go ahead and save this, we have our post created on our backend, and then we can be able to retrieve it. So let me go ahead and create a new post. So I can create another post which I may call our note 2, and then you can say that this is a second note. So what we have is when I save this, still we can be able to persist it on our backend. Even if when we refresh, we still have our notes just like we created them. So basically what we have is a backend API written in Django that allows us to persist these in our database. We also have our front end to help us create as well as to retrieve our notes. We can be able to actually add more posts. So let me add some dummy text right in here, and we can add some other dummy text. We can do something meaningful. When you go ahead and save this, we have our note added, and we have some flexbox right here, and we're going to look into how to create this. Now another thing is this is actually also responsive. So when we actually try to put it on a smaller screen, we actually see that it's responsive. We're going to look into how to put this together with ReactJS and the Django REST Framework. So this is actually the UI part, and let me show you the backend part. So when you go to our localhost 8000, so I'm going to go to localhost, and this is going to be our localhost 8000. And we're going to see that we have our backend API, which is written with the Django REST Framework. So when I go to our Swagger UI, so it's a localhost 8000/Swagger. What we have is our beautiful documentation of the various endpoints that we have on our API. So we're basically making use of the following endpoints. We're making use for the endpoint of getting all our posts. We're also making use of one for creating all posts, as well as one for deleting all posts. Actually, for deleting a post, what we do is to basically just come and we delete a post. So basically that gets rid of the post. So we're going to be putting this together, and I would really love you guys to follow along, as you'll be able to learn how to create a simple Django web application. Actually, a ReactJS application that basically works with the Django backend. So without further ado, let's get started. So to build our front end, you're going to need to have Node.js installed. Head over to nodejs.org and download the LTS version of Node.js and install it. It will give you access to the npm package manager, which basically will help you to install the dependencies that are necessary for the for the ReactJS application. So I'm going to start with the back end of this project. So what I'll do is to head over to my empty folder that I've opened up in Visual Studio Code. So I'll basically open it right here, and you have a blank folder right here. So what I'm going to do is to first create a folder, and in this folder I'm just going to call this, actually let me just call it the guest book. Actually this is going to be our guestbook API, so I'll just call it a guestbook API. And right within our guestbook API folder, I'm just going to go right in that folder. So I'm using git bash. I'm actually just going to select my git bash right here, and within the git bash, now what I'm going to do is to basically cd into that folder and then create a virtual environment. So I'll go in our guestbook API folder, and what I'll do is to create a virtual environment with Python. Actually this is Python since I'm on Windows, so I'll say -m, then I'll call them as a command, and I'll call this env. So env is actually the folder in which we're going to create our virtual environment. So I'll run this command, and what it will do is to create a virtual environment within our guestbook API folder. Now that our virtual environment has been created, let's go ahead and install Django. So what I'm going to do is to basically activate our virtual environment with source, env, then we are going to use script since we are on Windows. Then I'm going to call the activate script. So this is going to go ahead and activate our virtual environment. Now after activating our virtual environment, I'm going to go ahead and actually install Django. So I'm going to pip, it's going to be pip install, and then I'll install Django. So this will go ahead and install Django within our virtual environment. Now that our Django has been installed, we're going to go ahead and create our Django project. So to do that, I'm just going to clear my terminal with Ctrl and L. And what I'll do is to basically go ahead and create our project with. So when you ls, in our folder right here, we have our env. But what you need is to create our Django project. So we're going to use our Django admin command that's provided to us by Django when we install Django within our virtual environment. So what I'll do is to call the Django admin command, and then I'll say start project. So we're basically going to start a project, and then we shall call our project. So we actually can call our project, let's say API, and this will go ahead and create our API project. So what we have is we've created the API folder, but let me remove it so that we have our many.py at the root of our folder. So to do that, I'll just simply run our command, and then I'll say dot, meaning that we're creating our project within the current directory. So when I do that, then what will happen is when we ls, we now have our manage.py file right inside our our guestbook API folder. So to test whether our Django installation has been successful, what I'm going to do is to run python manage.py and then run server. So this will actually run our local development server. So I'll click our link right here with Control and click, and this is going to open up in our Chrome. And now we can see that our installation of Django has been successful. So now that we have our Django installation successful, we're going to set up our API project, and we're going to create an app. So an app is just a module that allows us to have the functionality we need put together in one package or one module. So the next thing we're going to do is to basically create our app. So our app is going to be the one for our notes. So I'm just going to stop our server right here. And what I'll do is to create this notes app. So I'm just going to come and say python manage.py. So we shall start our app. So I'll run the start app command, and I'm going to give a name for this app. So I'll just basically call this the notes app. And when I run this, what we have is the notes app created for us. So we can see a new folder created right here. So even right here, actually, we have our notes app created. So when you have this, what we're going to do is to basically create our model. So our model is basically a class that describes how a database table is going to be. So in this case, we're going to describe how our note table is going to be in our database. So what I'm going to do is to close my terminal for now. So I'll head over to the notes app. And the first thing I have to do is to register this notes app onto our main project. So we have our notes app created right here, but we cannot be able to use it unless it's registered with our project. So to do that, I'll go to our app section. All I'll do is to copy the class notes config. So I'll head over to the API project that we created, and then within our settings.py, I'll look for the installed apps list. So I head over to the installed apps section or the list of installed apps, and I'll have to add the notes app. So to do that, I'll just say notes dot apps dot, and then I paste in the notes app config. So basically what this means is we are in our notes app, and then we are in the apps module, then we're accessing the notes config class that we've copied. Right after doing that, I'm going to go ahead and save, and after saving this, now the next thing is going to be to create our blog mode or our notes model in this case. So to do that, I'll just come right here in our models, and what I'll do is to create a class. So let me actually first model that out. So we're going to have a simple class, and this class is going to be our note class. So each note is going to have a title, and this title is going to be a string. So we are also going to have our content, which is going to be a string. We can add other extra fields such as the date created, and this will be a date time. So once we have this, then let's go ahead and create a class. So I'll just come right here and create a class, and this class is going to be for a node. So this node is going to inherit from models.model. So wherever we're creating a model class, we inherit from models.model. That's from Django. So I'll just come and basically create this as a model. Now the first thing we need on our model is going to be our title. So shall describe that by saying title. Actually, we're not using a title from title, so we're going to use our title, and this title is going to be models. Then this is going to be a string. We shall express this as a character field. So I'll just come and say character field, and then we can even provide a max length attribute, which basically tells us how long this will be. So I'm just going to add the max length, and our max length is going to be, let's say, 255. Now also going to add the content. So we're going to basically provide our content as a text field. So I'll just come right here and say it's going to be models.text field. So we have an extra field called our date created field, and this is a date time object. And what we want to keep this, we want to basically keep the time we create an object of type note. So to do that, I'll just come and provide this is going to be date created, and this will be models dot, and I'll say date time field, and then in this case I'll say auto now add is going to be for true. So once we have this, then what I'm going to do is to basically provide a simple string representation of these objects that we shall be creating from this class. So I'll do that by creating a dunder str method, and this is basically going to dictate how we shall be viewing these objects. So I'll just come right here and say this is going to be self, and we shall basically return the title of every note that we shall create. So I'll just say return self dot title. Now after having this, we've been able to create our note model. So after creating our note model, then what I'm going to do is to basically create a migration. So a migration is a file that describes the changes that we have made on our database. And when you create this migration, then you can go ahead and write those changes onto our database. So to basically create our migration, what I'll do is to pull up my terminal, I'll run python manual.py make migrations, and now this will detect a new change in our model. So in this case, we have created a model for our notes, and when you want this to be written to our database, we are going to run python manual.py and run server. Actually, this is for migrate. Sorry for this. So actually going to run python manual.py migrate, and this will basically go ahead and write all our migration, even including those that are default. So we now have our database created for us, which is actually by default our db.sqlite3. So now that we have our model created, we're going to go ahead and export this model via a REST API. So to do this, we're going to use our Django REST Framework. So I'm going to go ahead and install our Django REST Framework by calling pip install, and in this case we shall say I'm going to install Django REST Framework. So this will go ahead and install Django REST Framework within our virtual environment. And right now our Django REST Framework has been installed. So let's go ahead and basically export our modules via our REST API. So the first thing we're going to do is to add Django REST Framework to our install apps. So I'll head over to our API project right here. I'll go to the install app section. What I'll do is to add Django REST Framework. So you just simply add the package REST Framework to our installed apps. And after doing this, then we can be able to access the different things that come with Django REST Framework. I'm going to close our API folder for now. Now we're going to concentrate on our Notes app. So within our Notes app, we have a model. Now when you have a model, we need some way of basically returning objects created from this model via a JSON output. So I'm just going to create a new file right here, which I'm going to call our serializers file. So this is actually going to be serializers.py. And then within our serializers.py, I'm going to go ahead and create our serializer that's going to basically help us to return objects from our database as JSON, as well as to help us to create objects on our database using actually going to get our input as JSON and then convert it into objects that are stored within our database. So the first thing I'm going to do is to import serializers. I'm actually first going to import our models. So I'll say from models, meaning from the models module in our folder. I'm just going to simply import, and this is going to be our node class. So when you import our model, then I also import our serializer. So I'll say from REST, it's actually going to be from REST framework. We are going to import our, so in this case, we're going to import our serializer. So I'll just come and import our serializers. So I'm just going to create a class that's going to be our serializer class. So I'm just going to come and say class, and this is going to be our node serializer class. So our node serializer class is going to inherit from our serializers. So I'll just call serializers dot. In this case, we're going to have model serializer. So what a model serializer basically does is to, based on the fields we have on our model, to create our serializer. So I'm just going to come and say it's going to be our model serializer. We shall create a meta class. So our meta class is basically going to describe information about the serializer. So we shall have our model, and our model in this case is going to be our node model. So after having this, then we can have the various fields. So fields, and in this case we are just going to have our fields. So we shall have things such as, it can be a list of fields. For example, if we have a list of fields, we can have all fields. We can also have a list of fields. Now in this case, what we're going to have is all fields. So basically specify that we just say Danda all, and that's going to basically specify that we're going to need all the fields that we have on our model to be part of our serializer fields as well. So when you have this, then what we're going to do is to actually create viewsets. So viewsets are going to allow us to basically take in requests and then return responses. Take them like views. They get HTTP requests and then return HTTP responses. So let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to do that. So right here, what we're going to do is to go ahead and create our views. So I'm just going to go to views.py, and then we're going to create viewsets. So viewsets are going to allow us to basically take in HTTP requests and then return HTTP responses. So to create our viewsets, I'll have to import our model first. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll say is from .models, we are going to import our node model. And then I'm also going to go ahead and import our viewsets from Django REST Framework. So I'll do that by saying from REST Framework dot, actually we're just going to say from REST Framework, we're going to import our viewsets package. And right after importing our viewsets, then what I'm going to do is to go ahead and create our viewset class. So I'm just going to come right here and say that we're going to have our nodes viewset. So going to be our viewset, and then this is going to be inheriting from viewsets.model viewsets. So what this is actually going to allow us to do is to create the different CRUD endpoints that will allow us to create our nodes, read them, update them, and delete them without that much of a hassle. So right after creating our model vset, we are going to go ahead and specify which serializer we're going to use. So in this case, we'll just come and provide our serializer. And our serializer in this case is going to be our node serializer. So we shall have to import that from our serializer module. So I'll come right here and say from .serializers, we are going to import our node serializer. So I'll just come right here and provide our node serializer. And after importing our node serializer, then we shall also have to specify the query set attribute. So we are just going to write our query set attribute like so. Our query set is actually going to be node dot objects dot all, and this is going to actually specify the default query set that we shall be using for this particular view set. And after creating our view sets, we now have all our required endpoints implemented. Now we need a way that we're going to show Django REST Framework which URLs to use for this specific view set. So I'm just going to head over to our main project URLs or our project level URLs, and what I'll do is I'll first remove the comments at the top, get rid of them, and what I'm going to do is to basically register our viewset onto our main URLs. So to do that, I'll have to import our viewset. So I'll just come right here and say from, in this case I'm going to import them from our notes app, and then I'll say from notes app.views we are going to import our notes viewset. And right after importing our notes viewset, I'm going to go ahead and create a router. So to create a router, I have to import the default router from Django REST Framework. So I'm just going to do that by saying from REST Framework dot. In this case, we're going to import it from dot routers. We shall import our default router class. So when you have a default router class, we're going to create an instance of the default router, and then we shall go ahead and register our viewset onto this router. So to do that, I'll just come and say router is going to be equal to our default router. So we're going to have our default router, and after having our default router, then we can be able to register each of the viewsets we've created in our application. So I'll just come and say router.register, and in this case we shall have a prefix. So in this case we shall just call it posts, and when we have this, then I can go ahead and also specify the viewset. So in this case it's actually going to be a notes viewset. So just going to have our notes viewset. Now that we have our notes viewset, we need some way of adding this router onto our URLs. So to do that, I'll just actually come right here, and what I'll do is to specify our path. So our path in this case is going to have a route. So our route is going to be the route or the route endpoint, and then what we shall do is to add our viewset. So in this case, to add this, we shall just have to include. So I'm actually going to include this. I'm going to import this from Django.url. So the include function is basically going to allow us to include URLs onto our URL. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we're going to include all URLs from our router. So I'll just come and include our router dot URLs. And when I save this, hoping that our server is still running, actually we stopped it. So I'm just going to run it with Python 3 manu.py and then run server. Actually, this is going to be a Python, sorry for that. So right now we have our server running a localhost 8000. So when you go to our server right now, it's going to go to our Chrome, and right now what we have is our default route or our post route. So when you head over to this route right here, we now have a, so actually this is supposed to be a serializer class attribute, not a serializer. So we're going to correct this by going back to our Visual Studio Code right here, and what I'll do is to head over to our views, and we're going to specify this as our serializer class. So when I save and head over to this, right now we see that we have an empty list of posts. So we can actually use the Django browsable API to create this post. So I'm just going to come right here, I'll create a post such as note 1, and then we shall provide the content as this is the first note. So provide this as the first node, and I'll go ahead and post this to create this. Actually, let's see. So let me actually go ahead and see. So when I go to our URLs, I need to correct something. So when I go to our URLs.py, maybe I have to first remove this. So I'm going to remove the post. And when I refresh, so what we need is actually to go to our post. So when I refresh this, we now have slash post. Now it's working. So basically we have our route that's going to point to our route URL, and then we shall have to go to slash post. So when you go to slash post, I'm going to try to create a new post. So when I go to, so let's say create new post, so I'll say note 1, and then I say this is the first note. So when I post this, so now we have our first note created. I'll go ahead and create a second note. So let's say note 2, and then I'll say this is the second note. So when I post this, we now have our second note created. So when I say get, this is actually going to return all the notes we've created. So right now our API is working. So let's go ahead and document this using our Swagger UI. So to document this, we're going to use our DRF-Yasg package. So I'm just going to look for it, and just going to say DRF-Yasg, and I'll have to first install it. So I'm just going to go to the documentation right here, and when you have the documentation, we are going to go to the serving the schema section, and what you're going to have, actually we're going to, let's start from the root. So I'm just going to head over to this configuration. So what you're going to do is to basically add these endpoints onto our code. So I'll just have to copy all of this code right here, and then I'll head over to our project level URLs, and then I'll have to add this by saying, so I'm actually just going to paste it in here. And when I paste it in here, what I'm going to do is to get these URL patterns right here, and I'll have to add these URL patterns onto our root URL patterns. So to do that, I'm just going to basically add them. So I'll change these RE paths to paths, just like we have here. So I'm just going to come and remove these RE paths. So I'm just going to make them regular paths, and I'll remove these regular expressions. So I'm just going to remove the regular expressions. Actually, what one endpoint that we're going to have is just going to be for our Swagger UI. So I'm just going to keep it to Swagger. And when you have this, I'll have to basically remove all the regular expressions here. Sorry for this. So just going to keep it to Swagger and Redox. So when you have this, I'm going to go ahead and now install our DRF-Yasg within our virtual environment. So I'll have to install it with pip install, and then it's going to be DRF-Yasg. And let's look at how we can set it up. So right now, after installing it, we have to add it to our install apps, and then we also have to have django.contrib.static files added to our static files. So I'm going to go to our project level settings file, and in our project level settings file, I'll then have to add also our DRF-Yasg. So I'll just come and say DRF-Yasg. And after adding this, we also have our static files already added for us, which means we are safe in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and now we have our package installed. So when we run python 3 mani.py run, so this is actually going to be run server. Actually, it's going to be python mani.py run server. We now see our server is running. So let's head over to our UI right here. So when you go to our localhost 8000, we are going to basically go to our root URLs, and when you go to our endpoint. So let's go to our Swagger UI endpoint. We now see we actually don't have the Swagger UI endpoint. Let's see what happens. So we go back to our Visual Studio Code. We are going to check our URL. So let's go to our urls.py. It seems like we just didn't save, so I'm going to save. And when I head over to our UI right here and I refresh, we now actually see our Swagger UI with the various endpoints we have for our API. So the benefits of using Viewsets and routers is you get most of the CRUD routes implemented for you without doing that much of a hassle. For example, we have that one for creating all posts, getting all posts, creating all posts. We can get a post by its ID. We can be able to update and delete a post as well without having to actually implement these endpoints from scratch. So right now we've been able to implement most of our API, but let's go ahead and change some of this. So I'm going to head over to our project level URLs, and then I'll provide, so this is actually going to be our guestbook API. So I'm just going to call it the guestbook API, and we're going to specify this as our version 1. Then we may provide a description as this is our guest book API. Then we can remove some of this since we don't need them that much. And once we have this, then when I go back here, we actually have now our guestbook API. So we've been able to implement most of our endpoints of our API. Now it's time to move on to the front end part of our application. All we're going to need to develop our front end is going to be Node.js. So just like I said, all we need is to go to nodejs.org and install our LTS version of Node.js, which is currently 16.14. So since I have Node.js installed, I'm not going to walk into that process. All I'm going to do is to go to our Visual Studio Code and within our folder of our project. So I basically have our guestbook API folder. So I'm actually going to open up my terminal. I'll stop the server right now. And after stopping this server, I'm going to basically cd out of the guestbook API project. So just going to go to our root URL. So right here we actually have our guestbook API folder. And what I'm going to do is to now create our React app. So I'm going to create our React app using create React app, which is going to create for us a boilerplate code that we're going to use to develop our React app without having to set up stuff. So I'll just come right in here, and what I'll do is to say npx create React app, and then we are going to simply call this guest. Actually, I'll call this a guest. I'll call this a guest book client, or a guest book front end, or whatever you may want to call it. So this will go ahead and install everything we need for our guest book client project. So it's going to go ahead and install React as well as other dependencies that you may need for our front end. So I'm just going to proceed. Now that our front-end project has been created, we're going to go ahead and basically follow these instructions. We're going to cd into the guestbook client project, and we are going to start our server by running npm start. So to do that, I'll just simply Control L and I'll clear my terminal. So I'll cd into the guest. So in this case, we're going to cd into our guestbook client folder, and right after going into our guestbook client folder, what I'm going to do is npm start. Now this command is supposed to help us start our local development server. So this is actually supposed to start our local development server and open up our browser. And right now we see that our server is starting and our browser is going to open at localhost 3000, which means our React application has been installed successfully. So that means that we have our React running successfully. Now we're going to go ahead and create our page just like we created our project at the beginning of the video. So we're going to go back and look at the project we created. Now what I'm going to go and do is to go to that project, and then we shall explore some of the stuff that project has, and then we implement those one by one. So what we have right now, so our front end is basic front end. Basically what you have is this header section, and this header section has two components. So we have our heading, which is our guest book, and we also have a button that's basically to help us to open this model. So we are going to first implement this in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is to also look at the background color we have here. So I'm just going to come and check this out. So our background color in this case is going to be RGB as 4380. So I'll have to implement that in a second. Now, before we do anything, what I'm actually going to do is to first remove this basic React code that's basically brought to us by default. So I'll do that by going to our Visual Studio Code. Now close some of these files that we have of our API. So we're going to be doing most of our work within our React app. So I'll just simply have to close this, and what we're going to be dealing with now is going to be our client folder. So within our client folder, we have the source folder in which we are going to have all the files that are specific to our front end. So I'm going to basically open this up. Now open a new terminal right here. So I'm actually going to remove this. I'm going to open a new git bash terminal. So this is actually going to be git bash. So once I have this, then I'm going to cd into our guestbook client. So I'm going to go into our guestbook client, and then within the guestbook client, the first thing I'm going to do is to remove everything in our source folder. So we're going to have one index.js file, which is going to be the main entry point of our application. So I'm going to remove everything. So I'll say remove everything in our source directory. And now we are going to have an empty source folder. So after doing that, then I'm going to create a new file, which I'm going to call the index.js file. And this index.js file is simply going to have our basic, or actually our entry point app component. So what I'm going to do is to create this app component. So to create this app component, I'm going to first import React from React, since it's going to allow us to make use of our JSX. So I'll start with import React from React. And after importing React from React, then I also have to import the React DOM. So the React DOM is where we're actually going to render our main app component. So I'm going to import our React DOM by saying import React DOM. Actually, this is going to be import React DOM from React DOM. And after importing this, then I'm going to go ahead and create our app component. Now, our app component is going to be a functional component. And by that, I mean we're going to use a function that's going to return our JSX. So I'm just going to come and say const, and then I'm going to call our component, the app component, which is going to be equal to a function. So this function is going to return some JSX. So once I specify this, then what I'll do is to basically return some JSX. So JSX is JavaScript, but in form of like HTML. It has some HTML-like syntax to it. So to do this, I'm just going to write a simple div, and within this div, I'm going to write a simple h1, and this h1 is going to be hello world. And right after doing this, then what I'm going to do is to render this in our React DOM. So to do that, I'll just call React DOM, and then I call the render function. Now this render function takes in two things. It takes in the component you want to render in our React DOM, as well as where we want to basically render it. So what I'm going to do is to specify that we want to render our app component or our main app component, and then because now we are calling this as our app component, so we call this with this JSX syntax, and then after calling this, then we have to specify where in our document we want to basically put this specific component. So I'm going to do that by using query selector. So I'm going to use the DOM. I'm going to say document.query selector, and then right in here I'll specify that div with the ID of root. So I'm going to show you where that div is in a second. So I'm just going to come and specify that this is going to be ID of root. Now note that I'm using ID of root, and that is because of the hashtag and then the root. So this is basically selecting that specific element with the ID of root. So if we want to look at that specific div with the ID of root, all we need to do is to go to our public folder, and then within index.html we see the various HTML that's rendering our React page. And right in here we have our main div, which is the div with the ID of root, and this is where we actually render most of our app components. So I'm just going to come right here within our index.js and save. So when I save, when you head over to our Chrome right here, when I refresh, actually right now it's running the server that we have, our React server from our project. So I'm just going to stop that. Just going to come to my Windows terminal. What I'll do is to stop this server, so I'll do that with saying yes. I'll actually just close the Windows terminal with all the tabs. So when I close that, then what we're going to have in this case is going to be our hello world rendered within our main app component. So let's go ahead and organize our app. So now that we have our hello world, we're going to basically implement our header. We're going to have our title as well as our add button. We're also going to have our background color of the entire page. So I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to create one CSS file that's going to have our styles. So I'm just going to come to our source right here, and I'm going to create a folder which I'm going to call styles, and this styles folder is going to have our CSS. So I'm just going to create one main CSS file. So I'll call this main.css, and then within main.css I'm going to specify the following. So I'll start with specifying that everything is going to have a padding of 0 as well as a margin of 0 by default. So we're going to have a margin of 0, and then we can have our box sizing as a border box. So when we have this, I'm going to go ahead and save. So when we come right to our React app right here, and nothing is going to actually take effect because we haven't yet specified this file in our CSS. So I'm just going to come right here in our index.js, and what I'll do is to import our main CSS so that you can be able to see our styles taking effect. So I'm just going to import so I'm just going to go into our styles, then I'll call our main.css. I'm going to save, and when I save, I'm going to come right here. Right now we see that our changes are taking effect. So I'm also going to specify that our font family. So I'll just come here and say we're going to have our font family, as we can say that this is actually going to be Helvetica Sans Serif. So when I save this, when you go back right here, you'll see that our font has changed. So let's go ahead and implement our header. So I'm just going to come right here within our index.js, and what I'll do is to create our header. So I'm just going to basically create our header. I'll create a div and I'll call this header. Actually, if I want to do like this, then what I'll do is to change this from JavaScript with VS Code. So I'll just come and click on JavaScript, and then we say that we want to edit this as JSX. So this will actually help us to code like we're coding HTML. So I'll do something like dot, and then I'll specify that this is going to be our header. And now we have our div with the class name of header. And note that we don't use class because class is a special word in JavaScript. So right now, when I create class name is equal to header, we are going to have two things within our header. We're going to have our title, which is going to be this guestbook title, as well as our add post button. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to create two divs. So I'm just going to create the first div, and this is going to have our title. I'm actually going to call this our title, or let me actually just call it our logo. And then within our logo, I'm just going to add a simple paragraph. Now this is going to be our title, and now we're going to have this as guest book. So I'm just going to call this guest book, and then right in here, what I'm going to do is to actually create another. I'm going to create another div. Sorry for that. I'm going to create another div, and this is actually going to be for our, I'm actually going to just call this the add section, and then within here I'm just going to add, actually this is going to be an a tag, so I'm going to call this an a tag, and it's not going to have an href for now, so I'll actually say it's going to have an href It's not going to direct us to any page. We shall just keep on the same page. I'm going to change this to an anchor tag. So it's going to be our anchor tag, and we're going to give this a class name of add button. So when I save this and head over to our UI, when I refresh, we now see we have the two things right here. We have our guest book as well as guest book. So I'm going to change this to add a note. Actually, I'm going to call this add note, and when I save, we now see that this is going to be add note. So what thing we're going to do is to basically style this up. So what I'm going to do here is to come to our main.css. So we have our background color from our main project or our main app. So I'm just going to basically scan it right here, and we have I actually have a color picker extension in my Chrome. So we have RGB 4380. So what I'm going to do is to specify that our body is going to have that background color. So I'll just come right here and say that our body is going to have a background color of RGB, and in this case we're going to have it's 7, 43, and 80. So I'll just come right here and say 7, and then 43, and then 80. I'm going to save this, and when you head over here we have our background color set. So now let's work on our header. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'm going to say that our header is going to actually be having a padding of, let's say, 20 pixels, and save. So right now we see, so when I refresh, we have our padding. So let me actually, it's actually a div with a class name of header, so we need to say dot header, not header. So when I save this, we now see our padding taking effect. So let's go ahead and add a display of flex. So I'm just going to come here and add a display flex so that we can have these things in a raw format. So I'll say display flex, and then we shall justify content. So this is actually going to be space between. So I'll go ahead and save. Right now we see that these are now distance from each other. Let's increase our padding to around 25 pixels. So we have something like this. Now let's go ahead and style our title. So I'm just going to come right here. What I'll do is to style this title. So I'll style it by saying the title, and we shall have this title having a font. So let's say our font size is going to be 30 pixels. So I'm just going to say we're going to have a font size at 30 pixels, and also going to have our color as white. So we're going to have our color as white. So this is actually going to be our color of white. Now we're also going to style our add btn. So I'm just going to call add btn. So we shall give it a padding of, let's say, 15 pixels, and we shall give it a background color. So the background color is going to be the same as our white. I'm actually just going to give it a white. We shall give it a border radius, and this border radius is going to be, let's say, 20 pixels. Actually, let's give it 10 pixels. So when we save this, we now have this added here. Now we are going to, since it's an anchor tag, then we're going to specify that we don't need any text decoration on it. So I'll do that by saying text decoration none. And now we have this. So I'll actually also text transform. So we're going to change that to uppercase. So I'm actually going to change this to uppercase. So we have something like this. Now, since we have it at the top, we need it to come down. So what I'm going to do is to basically add some margin top to our add section. So I'll do that by saying that add. So this is actually going to be our add section. And right here, I'll say that our margin top is going to be, let's say, 20 pixels. So when I save this, we now see that our button has moved down. So let's actually reduce this to 10. And right now we have our button a bit linear to our title. So basically what we have now is our guest book title, as well as this button that will allow us to create a note. So let's go ahead and also add the color to it. So I'll provide our color, and our color in this case is going to be RGB 743 and 80. So when I save this, we now set for our header. So we actually also have, let me actually close my color picker right here. So we actually have also this div that's showing no notes. That's when we don't have any notes within our database or our backend. So to implement this, what I'm going to do is to come right here and I'll add this div. So I'm just going to call this uh, a div with a class name of, let's say this is going to be posts. So I'm actually not going to call this posts. Actually, let me just call it post for now. And within here, I'm just going to add text. So I'm just going to add a simple paragraph and I'll call this center text. And this center text paragraph is going to have no posts. That's if we don't have any posts. So I'm just going to call it no posts. And when we have this, I'm going to come right here and we have no posts. So I'll first add height to this. So I'll just come right in here and I'll give this a height. So I'll say dot post. So dot post is going to have a height. So let's provide a height. So this height is going to be 80 view height, which means 80% of our screen. So when I save this, what you're going to do is to actually place our center text in the center. So to do this, I'll have to basically add our post to the center. So I'll do this by saying, I'll actually do it by saying that when we have a height as that, shall have display flex, and then we shall justify content to center, and then we shall align our items to our center. So let's see this in action. So right now we have our no post center text. So I'm just going to increase the font size of this. So I'll go back to our Visual Studio Code, and then I'll say that our center text. So let's actually see what we call it. We call it center text. So I'm just going to come and say center text, and this is going to have a font size. So I'll just basically give this a font size of 40 pixels. So when I save, when I go back to our Chrome right here, we're going to have it as no post. We shall also give it a color. So just going to come right here and I'll give it a color, and this color is going to be white. So right now we have something similar to our main app. So another thing we're going to do is also implement this model that you shall be able to click on and display. So I'm just going to remove that. So I'm just going to come right here, and the next thing we're going to be building is going to be our form model. So I'm just going to come right in here in our VS Code, and what I'll do is to create this. So I'm just going to create a new section, and I'll just simply call this. So I'm just going to call this dot model. And when we have our dot model, it's actually going to be a, a large model, or it's going to cover our entire screen. So I'm going to style this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create this model by saying I will give it a height. I'm actually just going to say that's going to fill our entire screen. So I'll just say it's going to have a height of 100%. Then we shall specify that's also going to have a width of 100% of the entire screen. And once we have that, then we have to specify that's going to be at the top, at the extreme top of our page. So we're going to give it top 0, and then we shall also want it to be at the extreme left. So we shall give it a left of 0. Now we're also going to provide a position of fixed. So I'll provide its position as fixed. But for now, let me give it a background color of, let's say, black. So when I save this, I'm going to go back to our front end. So right here we see it's not yet existing. So let's see actually what we did wrong. So we have our model. We actually didn't save right here. So when I save, we now see that our black model is now covering the entire screen. So now we're going to make this transparent using RGBA, so that it appears to something that we have right here. So when I close this, when we go back right here, we're going to make it as transparent as possible. So I head over to our VS Code right here, and within our main.css, I'm just simply going to come and I'll reduce this opacity right here. Good enough, we have this tool that can allow us to do that. So I reduce it to something like this. And when I go back to our Visual Studio Code, now we have it as transparent. Now the next thing we're going to do is to basically create a simple form within our model. So to do that, I'm just going to come within our VS Code, and what I'll do is to create within our index.js file, I'm just simply going to come and create our form. So I'll call this .form. It's going to be a div with a class name of form, and within this I am going to basically go ahead and specify how it's going to look like. So I'm just going to come within our CSS, and since we have our model, so actually our form is going to be within our model. So I'll create .form, and then I'll give this, let's say, a background color of white. So within this, we're going to specify our width. So let's have our width as let's say 50% of the entire UI, and then we're also going to have a margin of auto, so that it's actually placed within the middle. So we shall have a margin as auto. So when I go right to our Chrome right here and I refresh, so we actually don't have it right now. So let's go back here. So let's say we give it a height of let's say 500 pixels. So when I save this, we now have our model displayed, our form displayed here. So I'm actually just going to give it a margin of top as well. So I'll just come and give it a margin top of, let's say, 20 pixels. And this is actually going to pull it slightly below. So let's actually specify that our margin top is going to be 30. And now we have it right here. So we shall give it a border radius as well. So let's give it a border radius. So let's say 30 pixels. And we have something like this. Now we're going to go ahead and basically add the contents of this form. So the first thing we're going to have is going to be, so when you click add post, we have create a note as well as this X button that's supposed to close our model. So we're going to go ahead and implement this. So now I'm going to go back to our Visual Studio Code, and what I'll do is to basically add our form. So what we're going to use is conditional rendering. That's going to allow us to close the model as well as to open it. So we shall have different styles for our model. So I'm just going to come right here, and the first thing I'm going to do is to add our form element. So we're going to first create a div, and this div is going to have our title, just like we see here. So we have a title, which is create a note, as well as our close button. So I'm just going to go ahead and implement that. So I'm just going to come and implement that. So the first thing I'm going to add, I'm just going to come and add dot title. I hope I don't have that class anywhere, so I don't have it. So I'm just going to call it dot title for now. And then within dot title, I'm going to create I'm actually just going to create a div. So this is going to be an empty div. I'll just call it div. And then within this div, I'm just going to add a paragraph that I'm going to call the form header. So it's actually going to be the form header text. And this form header text is going to have, actually, instead of calling this a title, let me just call it a form header. So I'll just call this the form header, and within here I'm just going to have a paragraph which is going to have our form header text, and then I'll just simply call this create a note. I'm actually going to close this so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to have div with a class name. Actually, it's going to be a paragraph with a class name of form header text. So we're just going to create a note here, and I'm going to also come right here, and what I'll do is to create another div, and I'm going to add an anchor tag. So I'll just simply give this a class name. I'm actually not going to redirect to anywhere. I'll give this a class name of, let's say, a close button. So I'll just do that by saying this is going to be a close button, and then it's just simply going to be an X. So when I save this and head over to our UI, so when I go back to our Chrome, we have our created note and our X right here. So what I'm going to do is to style this up. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'll style up our form header first. And this form header is going to have a padding of 20 pixels. So we have something like this. Now I'm actually going to also style up our form header text. So we're going to have our form header text, and this form header text is actually going to be a font size. So let's actually give it 40 pixels and see. So it's actually going to have 40 pixels. Let's actually look here. So I'll maybe reduce it to 30 pixels. So that we have something like this. Now we also want to style up our close btn. So I'm just going to come right here and say close btn, So our close btn is going to have a text decoration of none. It's actually going to be none. And then we are going to go ahead and also style this up. So I'll give it a font size of, let's say, 25 pixels. And then I'll basically give it a color of, let's say, RGB 743 and 80. So that when you go back here, we have this. Now, since these are located in the same div, I'm just going to use display flex so that they can be in the same row. So to do that, I'll just come to our form header and I'll say that we're going to have a display for flex, and this is actually going to basically place them in the same row, and shall also have some justify content, and I'll specify that to be space between, so that will basically go ahead and space them. Now to our close btn, I'm also going to have a margin top, and I'll basically say our margin top is going to be 10 pixels, just to place it slightly below and make it in the same line with the create note title. So once we have this, then all we're going to do is to now create our form elements. So according to this, we have a title and a content and a save button. So what I'm going to do is to add this. So I'm just going to come and provide this within our index.js file. So I'm just going to come and create this. So right now we have our form header, and now we're going to have our form, and this form is not going to have any action. So I'm just going to come and say form. Now within our form, we're going to have so let's say we're going to have a form group. So each form label and input is going to be located within a form group. And we shall have a label. So our label is going to have an HTML4, which basically stands for the basic HTML4, and we're going to say that this is going to be for the title, and right in here we shall say that it's going to be for our title. And then we're also going to have an input of type text, then we shall call this our form control. So this is going to be for our title, and then we should also have our ID as title, and this is going to actually create our input. So now we have our input right here. So let's go ahead and style that. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say that our labels are going to have a font size of, let's say, 20 pixels, and then we are also going to style up our form groups. So each of our form groups is going to be having a padding of, let's say, 20 pixels. So when I save this, right now we see that there's some spacing in our form group. Now let's go ahead and also style up our form control. So I'll do this by saying that we're going to have our form, actually this is going to be our form control, and this form control is actually going to be having a width of 100%. So I'm just going to come and say width, and shall have 100%. So when I save, we are actually going to have something like this. So I'm actually going to also give in a padding. So I'll give in a padding of 20 pixels, and right now we have something like this. So let me actually reduce it to 15. So we currently have something like this. So when we have this, I'm going to go ahead and also style up our text area. So I'm going to add the text area for the content. So I'm just going to come and provide that. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'll copy this and paste it right here. But in this case, we're not going to have our input. What we're going to have is the text area. So I'm just going to come right here and remove this. So I'm just going to come and simply say we're going to have a text area. Now the name of this text area is going to be for our content. So I'm just going to add our content. So I'm actually going to change this label to our content. So this is actually going to be for our content. So when I save this and head over right here, we now have our content and our text area. So I'm just going to add our class of form control, and this is going to be for our form control. So I'll basically call this our form control. So when I save this and head over right here, we now have our form control added here. So I'll maybe reduce the number of rows that we have. I'll reduce them to around, let's say, 5. So we have something like this. Now the next thing is to actually add our button for saving our notes. So I'm just going to come and basically add it right here. So I'll do that by adding a simple form group. So I'll just say dot form group, and right in here I'm just going to come and provide an input of type submit. Now give it classes such as btn. So this is actually going to be our btn. I'm actually having this is actually going to be a type submit input. It will have a type of value of let's actually go and see what we call it, save. So just going to have save right here. So I'm just going to have save, so that when you come here we have our button with save. So let's style this up. I'm actually going to give it a class name of btn. So when I save this, I'm going to go to our main.css, and I'll say we're going to have a .btn, and right in here I'll give a padding, and this padding is going to be a padding of 20 pixels. Shall have a background color of, let's say, RGB 4380, and then I'll provide a color of white. So our color is going to be white, and then this is actually going to be it. So I'll provide a cursor of pointer. So I'm just going to say cursor pointer, so that when you click it, we have our cursor changing. And then I'm also going to remove the border, so I'll just say border is none, just to add some little styling onto it. So when I come here, we now see that our cursor pointer is working perfect. So what you have is our model and our form that can be able to allow us to create our posts. But right now it's not functioning. Actually, when you click our function for submitting our data, this is actually refreshing our page, something we don't like. Now let's work on how we can be able to close this model. So we're going to be using our state variables. We're going to be making use of the useEffect, of the useState hook. And the useState hook is a React hook that basically allows us to set state and to update our state. So what you're going to do is to create our state for closing and opening our model. So I'll come to our index.js right here. And what I'll do is to come and create our state variable. So I'll do this with const, and then I'll provide a list of what we are going to have as our state and updater function. So I'm just going to come right here and say this is going to be equal to useState. So useState is actually going to be imported from React. And now useState takes in two things. So when we create a state variable, we need the state variable itself. So I'm just going to call that model visible. And then we also going to need an updater function that's going to update our state. So it's going to be set model visible. So when we have this, we are going to set the first state of our model visible. So in this case, what we need is our model to be to not be shown at first. So we're going to set this to false, meaning that by default our model is going to be false. And using our state updater function, we shall be able to set the state to what we want. For example, let's say if we want to open it, we shall set it to true, and it will be false in case we close it. Now let's also change our styles. We're going to add styles for our form, for our model form, in case we do not want to display it. So I'll head over to our main.css. I'm actually going to save this. And what I'll do is to go to our model. So we have our model, and this is our model as it's going to be, it's not going to be displayed. So I'll just come right here, and what I'll do is to add display, and this display is going to actually be the display block when it's visible. So I'll add another styling which is also going to be the same. So I'll just say model. So I'll just come and say model. I'll actually say model not visible. So this is actually going to be the class that we shall have for our model in case it's not visible. So I'm going to be using conditional rendering with our state variable. So what we have here is we're actually going to have model not visible. So this will be display none, since we don't want it to be shown. So we need to have a display of none. And when you have this, then what I'm going to do is to come to our index.html, our index.js. Actually, we don't need our index.html right here. So Within here, what I'm going to do is to specify to use conditional rendering to set our class name. So I'm just going to come right here, and what we shall have is this conditional statement. So we shall have our class name being equal to model if our model is visible. So to do that, I'll just say model visible, and then I'm going to use this operator. So I'm going to use this syntax, a model visible, then specify the class if the model is visible. So that will be our model class. And then if it's not visible, we want to specify that our model is not going to be visible. So I'll use the class of model not visible. So I'm just going to come right in here, and I'll basically paste our model not visible. So when I save this, we head over here, and now we see that since we have our state variable set to false, we now see that our model is not visible. So what we need is now to click this button and be able to show our model. So to do that, I'm just going to come right here, and on our add button, I'm just going to come right here and provide an on-press listener or an on-click listener. So this on-click listener is actually going to be setting our state variable model visible to true. So I'll just basically add in a simple function right here, and this function is actually going to set our model visible to true. So when I save this, I am going to be able to show our model. So when I go back here and press our button, we now see that our model is going to be visible. Now what we need is to actually click our close button and be able to close our model. So to do that, I'll just simply do the same thing. So I'll go to our close button right here. I'll add an on-click listener. So I'll just come and say on-click. And when I come here, I'll add a simple function. So this function is going to be setting our model visible to false or to not model visible. So I'll just actually come and say set model visible. I can either say false, and when I click here, actually when I add the not, I can click here and our model will disappear. Or what I can actually do is to say not model visible, because then when our model is visible, our state variable will be true, and if it's not visible, then it will be false. So when I save this, I can still come right here and add a note, and we shall see create a note. And if I close this, then our model will not be displayed. So let's go ahead and create some posts. So now we have our inputs, but these inputs are not working. So let's go back to our UI right here. So when I click add a note, right now I can be able to add some text in here, but we cannot be able to keep track of the values. Now we're going to use useState to set the initial values of these form elements, and we're going to be able to look into how we can get these inputs and set them in state. So I'm going to go right back to our code right here, and what I'll do is to set state variables for our title as well as our content. I'm going to create that with const. So we're going to have our state, which is going to be our title, and then we shall also have our state updater function, which is going to be our set title function, and this function is going to be equal to, so sorry for this, it's going to be equal to useState. Then we shall set the initial value of our title. It's going to be an empty string. We shall do the same thing for our content. So we shall say const, and this is going to be our content. So we are going to have set content, and right now we shall have this being equal to useState, and then we shall have it as an empty string as well. Now after doing this, then we're going to specify that the values of our text inputs are going to be the values of our state for title as well as our content. So what I'm going to do is to go to our form input of our title, and what I'll do is to specify our value. So I'm just going to come right in here, I'll provide an attribute of value, and this value is going to be for our title. And also put in a function that listens for any change in the text within this input. So that's going to be for on change, and we shall specify a function, and this function is going to take in an event, and then it's going to keep track of the event target value or the value of this input, and it will set our title to that specific value. So to do that, I'll just say set title, and then we shall set title to e dot, in this case we shall set target dot value. And once we have this, then we can be able to keep track of our title. Now we're going to do the same thing for our text area for our content. So I'll just come right in here in our text area, and what I'll do is specify that our value is going to be equal to our title, and we're going to have on change. So basically each time we are typing, so when I come right here and when I come here and say on change, this will be equal to a function that takes in e and then sets the content. So shall have set content to e dot target dot value. And when you have this, I'm going to save. So when I save, when you go back to our what you can do is to basically now print them out just to show our content. So I'm going to add a listener to our button for saving. I'll just come and say on click. So this is actually going to be on click. So I'll add an on click listener, and right here I'm just going to call this create note. So we're going to have a function called create note. So I'll just come before our return statement and create this function. So I'll say const create note, and this is going to be a simple function. So it's going to be an R function, and it's just going to console log our title. So we're going to console log our title, as well as we're going to log our title, as well as we're going to log our content as well. So when we have this in SF, I'm just going to simply go ahead and experiment with this on our UI. So when I go to our UI right here, I'm going to add a note, and when you have our title, so I'm just going to provide the title. It seems like we have the same value, so let's actually see. So it seems like we have the same value, so here we shall have our value as our content instead of our title. That's why you see that it's actually setting the state of our title to the same title. So when I come right here, I'm just going to add the post, and when I come provide a title, so this is actually going to be a title, and when I add, it's going to be our content. So when I go ahead and save, we now see that our form is basically refreshing our page, something we don't really like. So to do this, I'm just going to come and within our create post function, I'm going to add an event, and actually let me call this an event. Then before we do anything, I'm just going to set it to our default behavior. So we don't want our form to refresh the page. So I'll just come right here and say event dot prevent, and in this case we're going to prevent default. So basically this is actually going to stop our form from submitting and refreshing our page. So when I save this, I'm going to go back to our React app right here. So when I add a note, I'm going to provide a title. I'm also going to provide our content, and when you try to save this, you now see that our page is not refreshing. So if I inspect element, I'm going to go ahead and inspect this. So when you go to our console right here, I'm just going to pull up our console. We're going to use media queries to make this a little bit responsive. When I go to console here, we can see our title and our content being displayed. Perfect. So now we can be able to keep track of our title and our content. Now let's also make sure that every time we submit this, we set our initial state to an empty string. So when I go back here, I'm going to actually set this to our title and our content. So I'll just do that by saying set our title to an empty string, and then set our content to an empty string. So when I set this, right now our front end is going to actually refresh. When you go back to our note right here, we're going to provide a title, we're going to also provide a content, and when I save this, we now see that our form is now being cleared, which is good. So let's also go ahead and work on the responsiveness of this form. So what I'm going to do is to go right within our main.css, and what we shall do is to add a simple media query. So I'll say at media, and then in this case I'm going to specify that if the max width is around 700 pixels, so I'm just going to say 700 pixels, what we need is to actually have our form having a width of a certain width. So I'm just going to come and say dot form, and this form is going to be, so actually our dot form is going to have a width of, let's say, 80%. So when I save this, right now we see that our form is actually bigger than the way it was at first. So even when we reduce, we can still be able to input our text. So right now we see our form is responsive. Now we can also be able to add a note and keep track of our title as well as our content, which is good. So what we need is to actually close this model each time we create a post. So I'm just going to do that by, so the way I'm going to do that is by coming right to our index.js, and I'm just going to come and set our model visible false, meaning it will disappear our form. So I'm just going to come and say false. So when I save this, I'm just going to come and when I add a note, I create a title. When I create a content and save, it's actually going to go ahead and remove our model. So now we have this progress. Now let's go ahead and look into how we can set up our API to work with our front end. Now we're going to use what is called Django CORS-Headers. Django CORS-Headers allows us to share resources in between our client and our API. Now keep in mind that our API is located at localhost 8000 while our guestbook client is actually located on localhost 3000. So communicating in between these two is going to be hard as we're going to be running into CORS issues. But thanks to Django CORS-Headers, when you set it up, it actually makes our work simpler by allowing us to share resources between the two applications. So let's head over to the Django CORS-Headers documentation. So I'm just going to come to my Google Chrome right here, and I'll say Django CORS-Headers, and we shall head over to the API docs. So I'm just going to come to the PyPy right here, and the first thing is going to be to install it. So I'm just going to come and install it. So right here we are in our guestbook client project. So I'm going to head over to our guestbook API project. So I'll cd into our guestbook API project. So and then the first thing I'm going to do is to install our Django CORS-Header. So I'll provide our command to install it with pip. And that has installed our Django CORS-Headers within our environment. So when you go back here, what we have is Django CORS-Headers allows your resources to be accessed by other domains. For example, localhost 3000 in this case. So when you go right here after installing it, then we need to add it to our installed app. So I'm going to come right here. So I'm going to go to our project right here. I'm going to close our front end for now. When you go to our API section here, when you go to our API project, within our settings.py, I'm going to add our CORS header. So I'm just going to come right here and add our CORS headers. Hope you don't have any mistakes. It's actually CORS-Headers, and that's right. So when you go right here, they also tell us to add the CORS-Headers middleware to our middleware. So I'm actually going to add this. So I'll just copy this too. And within our within our settings.py, I'm going to the middleware section, and then within the middleware section, I'm just going to come and paste these two. So it seems like we have the common middleware already added for us, and we need to only add the CORS-Headers middleware. So I'm going to save this, and after adding that, now we need to do some settings. For example, we need to add the CORS allowed origins, which is just a list of every URL we allow our API to communicate to. So we're going to set this up as a list, just like you see here. We have our CORS allowed origins. We have example.com and that. So for our case, we need to add something like localhost 3000. So I'm just going to go ahead. So we even have regexes, we have allowed methods and stuff like that. So what you're going to do is to copy this list. I'm going to copy this list, and I'm going to add it to our list of allowed origins. So our list of allowed origins is going to have our URL of localhost 3000. So I'm just going to have two URLs. And what I'm going to do in this case is to have a localhost. So it's actually going to be a localhost 3000, and we can also have our IP address and then 3000. So when I save this, I'm going to go ahead and run our API. So when I run Python, actually it's going to be Python money.py, then run server. This is supposed to run our API. So we're going to actually try to communicate to our API using our front end in a second. So now our API is running. We don't run into our errors. What we need is to basically call our API from our front end. So I'm going to close this for now. Our settings of py. I'm actually going to close our API as well. So within our index.js, I am going to use a useEffect hook that's going to run every time we render our main app component. And this is going to make a fetch API call. So I'm going to actually use the fetch API. I'm not going to use Axios. I'm going to use fetch. And what we're going to do is to basically fetch the root endpoint of our API. So to do that, I'm going to minimize this for a second. I'm going to create a simple function. So this function is going to be, I'm just going to call this function get all posts, and this is going to be an async function. So I'm going to be using fetch API with async await syntax. So this is going to be a simple async function, and this async function is going to have our response. So I'm going to say that our response. So I'm just going to come here and say that our response is going to be await, and we're going to await in this case anything that may come as a result of fetching our URL. So which URL do we want to fetch? We want to fetch our localhost 8000/posts. So I'm just going to come right here and I'll copy our URL, and this URL is going to be our localhost 8000. So I'll basically add it in here. So I'll create a constant. So I'm just going to say const, and this is going to be our base URL, and this is going to be equal to our localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do in here is to fetch it. I'll just come and add these backticks, and then I'll add the syntax. So I'll say we're going to fetch our base URL and then slash. So what we need actually is to fetch all our posts. So I'll do that by saying fetch all posts. So the result of this is what we're going to have as our data, and what I'm going to do is to say const data is going to be any response that will be in form of JSON from this request. So I'll just come right here and say await. Sorry for this. So we're going to have await, and this is going to be response.json. So one thing is we are going to just check if the request is okay, and if it's okay, we're going to console log our data. So the way we do that is by saying if our response is okay. So we do that with response.okay. So we're going to tidy this up. Then what we're going to do is to console log our data. And if it's not okay, I'm just going to add an else statement right here. Then all we need to do is to console.log failed network request. So I'm just going to say failed network request. And once I have this, then I'm going to save. So I'm going to use the useEffect hook to run this function every time we render our main app component. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming right here, and I'll just come and say that useEffect. So this is actually going to be our useEffect hook, and we import that useEffect hook from React. So I'm just going to come and so the useEffect hook actually takes in two things. It takes in the effect of the function that we want to run each time we render our component, and the next thing is going to be our dependency list. So I'm just going to come right here and create that function. So this function is actually going to execute our get all posts function, and we're going to have an empty array of dependencies. So when I save this, I'm going to head over to our guestbook React app right here, and now we see that our posts are currently being fetched from our API. So we currently have two posts. So for example, even if we went to our API right here, when I try it out and execute, we see that our API has two posts currently, and what we need is to basically render these posts on our UI. So good enough being able to render them right now. So we now see that we have two posts on our API. So good enough, we've actually add Django-CORS-Headers, and it's kind of easy for us to add this onto our API, actually get this from our front end. Now that we have this thing, what we're going to do is to actually basically render our posts on our UI. So we're going to create components which are the basis of React as a framework. So we're going to create components for posts as well as the list of posts. So let's get started. I'm just going to come, and what I'm going to do is to create a new folder inside my source. I'm going to call this the components folder, and this components folder is going to have all components that we're going to use. So the first component we're going to create is going to be a component for an individual post. So I'm going to go ahead and create this as a simple React component. We're going to use it for the various posts that we shall have, so it's going to be reusable. So what I'm going to do is to say import. So we're going to import React from React, and I'll basically go ahead and create this. So I'll come and say that we shall have post, and this is going to be a post component, and this post component is going to be equal to a simple functional component. So it will return some JSX. So I'm just going to come right here and return some JSX. So I'll export this component. I'll export it to export post, and that will make it accessible outside our file. So let's go ahead and create this. So we now see that our post component is going to be in such a form. So when I close this, unfortunately, we don't have any posts here. So what you actually need is to see how those posts are. So let me actually close this for now. I'm going to close our API. So I'm going to show you the example from the project we actually created. So right now we have our notes, and what we have is a note component. So each note component has the title of the note as well as this X that's basically to delete that note. So let's look into how we're going to be building this. So what I'm going to do is to head over to our code right here. So I'm going to actually stop the code that we're running at first, which is for our project. So now I'm going to start our front end again. We have our API running, by the way, which is running at localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do is to set these things up to run. So we now have our development server starting. So let's go ahead and basically create our post component. So what I'm going to do is to come, it's actually the note component. So I'll have to rename this to note. So I'm going to rename this to note. And then I also have to name the component as note. So I'm just going to come and change this to note. So what you're going to have is our note. So this is going to stand for one individual note. So I'm just going to come and create a div. I'll actually uh, change this to JSX to make our life simple. So I'm going to create a div with ID of note, and within here we're going to split our component into two parts. We're going to have our content as well as our header. So I'm just going to call this the note header, which is going to be the upper component, and this is also going to have two divs. So we shall have a div, and this div is going to have our content. So our title, so our title, I'll just create a simple paragraph, and I'll give this paragraph a class name. So this class name is actually going to be the one for our note title. So I'll just basically provide note title. So this note title is going to have the value of our title, but then we shall provide it as appropriate in here. So I'll just come right here and say that our title is going to be a prop, and then I'll come right here and I'll provide our title. So we shall get this from the parent component, which will be our main app component in this case. So we're also going to have our actually going to have that button that's going to be responsible for deleting an item. So I'll just come right here and I'll provide a div. So this div is actually going to have an anchor tag instead. So this is going to have an anchor tag that we shall not that you shall click but shall not redirect to anywhere. And when you have this, I'll provide a class name. So I'll just provide this as close, and then I'll provide this as an X for deleting that specific note. Once you have this thing, I'll create the note content section. So I'll say note content. So it's actually going to be the note content, and within here we shall just have a paragraph and we shall have the content. Now this content will also be a prop, so this component. So I'll just come and say content. So once we have this, then we are going to be able to render our post on our UI. So using our node, we are going to map onto our list of arrays. So what we have here is we're going to have actually created a variable which is for our post. So this is a set variable that's going to be able to keep our posts, and set post which is going to update our posts. So it's going to be an empty array by default. Now when we have this empty array by default, when we get all posts, what happens is we actually log the data just like we saw in our example. So when you go back to our UI right here, we have an array containing our nodes. So when you go back here, when you come and we set this post to our data each time our component is rendered. So what happens is we query for our, we get to our API and get all the posts from our API. Then we set this list of posts to our data. Now once we have this, then what we're going to do is I'm just going to come here and comment this center text paragraph. Now when I comment it, I'm just going to come right in here, and what I'll do is to map or create a list of posts and then map onto actually we're going to map each item onto our list of posts. So let's do this. So what I'm going to come and do is to say posts dot map, and then when I come right here, what I'll do is to map each item of this list onto a nodes component. So the way I'm going to do this is by coming and saying, so we're going to actually just return each item. So I'm just going to come at the top right here. I'll import our node component that we created here. So I'll just come and say that we're going to import node from our component. So I'll just come and say that we shall have our node component. So the way we're going to do this is by saying node, and then our node will have a title. So in this case, our title will actually be the title of every item in that array. So we shall have item, and then we actually it's going to be item.title, and then we shall also have the content. So the content in this case is going to be the content of that specific item. So we shall have item.content. Let me put this little bit here so that you guys can see. So I'm going to actually also add our own press. So we also actually have our own press. So let's actually check. So this button doesn't have an on press. We hadn't yet added it. So let me add it. So we're going to actually add an on click. So this on click is actually what's going to happen when we click the X. So when we are deleting that specific item. So I'm just going to call this on click, and I'll also add it onto our prop. So I'll just come right here and say we're going to have on click. Yeah, so when I go back to the site in our index.js, I can specify on click, and then we shall be able to access this. So we're actually going to just create a function called delete item, and this will take in item dot id. So when we have this, I'm going to simply close this component right here. So what I'm going to do is to create that delete item function. So I'll just come right here and say we're going to have that function. So I'll just come and create it. So I'll say const delete item, and this is going to take in an item id. So let's actually call it the node id. So for now, what we shall do is to just console log that id. So I'll just come and say console dot log. So it's actually going to be console dot log, and then what we're going to log is a post id. Okay, actually it's the node id. So shall log the node id. So this is actually going to be a function component. So when I save this, when you go back to our UI right here, we are going to have our UI like this. So now we actually see our post as it comes from our UI. So in this case, we see that all our posts are going to be rendered from the middle, but we're going to fix this in a second. And also have a warning here that states each child in the list should have a unique key prop. Now, while rendering things in a list, we need some way of adding a unique identifier to each of these children. So I'll do this by coming right here, and we have to specify our unique identifier to actually be our ID. So I'll do that by coming to our UI right here, and what I'll do is to add our unique key prop. So I'll say key, and our key in this case is going to be the item ID. So I'll do that by saying item.id. So when you go right here, our UI will refresh. We shall have our ID logged, and we're going to fix that in a second. But what you see is the warning has gone away. So now let's go ahead and style this component up. So I'm just going to come right here in our main.css, and right now we have our styles right here. So I'm going to style our note. So I'm going to add our note. I'll give it a background color for white. So when I save this, refresh. So right now we see the background color changing to white. Alright, so I'm going to add a little bit of padding right here. So I'm going to add padding, and then shall say, let's say our padding is going to be 20 pixels. So this is going to change. We shall also provide border radius. So when I say border radius, and our border radius is going to be, let's say, 10 pixels. We shall also add some uh, transforms, but that's when we hover onto each of these nodes. So what I'm going to actually add the transition, I'm going to add the simple transition, and shall transition all, and then let it be in a time of like 1.2 seconds, and then yeah, so I'll add that. So each time we hover onto a node, so I'm just going to say node hover. It's actually going to be hover, and what we shall do is to transform and then scale each of these to 1.1 so that it enlarges in size, just like we saw in the example. So when I come here and try to hover onto it, we now see that it's now transforming. So let's look at how we can be able to basically style this so that we don't have them in the middle. So I'm going to close this for now, and what I'll do is to come and use conditional rendering so that we have our center text as well as our map, as our posts that are mapping onto our UI. So what we're going to do that is by coming, so I'm just going to come right here, and instead I'm going to basically, I'm actually going to remove our map statement right here, and I'm going to create a simple div. So I'm just going to call this div post list, and within our post list, that's where I'll add our map statement. And when you have our map statement right here, I'm going to use conditional rendering so that when you don't have posts, we can actually, when you don't have posts, we can actually be able to show no posts, and then when you have posts, we can show a list of posts. So what I'm going to do is to check this. So what I'll do is write our conditional rendering statement right here, and what we want to check for is the post length. So when you have our post.length, and if it's greater than 0, so that means if you have posts, what we want to actually render is this list of posts. So I'll just cut this, and what I'll do is to add this right here. So I'll add this, and in case we don't have those, I'm actually going to enclose this right here. I'm going to enclose these divs. So, and when I enclose these divs, what we're going to have actually, what we're going to have in this case is when we enclose this, then we're going to actually have, when we don't, in case we don't have those posts, you know, in case we actually have no posts, then we are going to render no posts. So let's see this in action. So when I add our posts, actually it's disorganized. So right now we see that our post has actually been added, but we then see that we have an overflow. So this is actually kind of large. So let's try to fix this. So now we have our posts, and we have everything working like the way it is, but let's tidy our code up. It's looking messy a little bit. I'm just going to come and change this, and I'll format this a little bit so that it looks nice. So what is happening is when we have posts, we render a list of posts, and then when we don't have posts, then we actually, it's supposed to be like this. So when you have posts, we render a list of posts. When you don't have posts, then we render no posts. So it's actually working. So now we have our post here rendered, but what we need is to specify the styles for our post. So when I go back to our main.css, I'm going to set width of every post, or every node in this case. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to uh, what we're going to have here is going to be our mean width. So we're going to have our mean width, and that mean width in this case is actually going to be 25% of the entire screen or entire UI. So when I save this and refresh, so I'm going to actually refresh, we are actually going to have this as let's actually see. So you have mid width as 25%. Now let's also have our mean height. So I'm actually going to provide our mean height, and that mean height is going to be 25%. So this actually proves that CSS is hard. So I'm going to save, and when I refresh, we now see a post has been created. So currently don't have any. We currently have only one post. So let me actually create another post. I'm going to head over to our create posts. I'm going to create a post. So maybe I'll provide the post as let's say another note, and then when I provide this, so it's going to be this is another note. So when I try to execute this, so right here we're going to have our request successful. So when I come back to our front end right here, we now have two posts. So now what we need is to basically make this display flex container. I think that's the reason as to why we have these two posts rendered in two separate rows. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'll just come right in here, and what I'll do is to go to our index.js. So the post list container or the post list div is where we're actually rendering all our posts. So I'll just come right here, and what I'll do is to basically style that up. So I'll say post list, and within our post list I am going to basically add a width. Actually, let's say that we're going to have a width, and this width, actually we're not going to have a width, but what we shall have is a padding, so that we'll put everything within. So we're going to add a padding of 20 pixels. So when I come right here, we'll see that things are a bit pushed inside. And once we have that, then what we're going to actually do is to also make this a flex container. So we're going to actually do this by saying display is going to be equal to flex. Then when we have this, then now we see that all of our items are now added into one row. So we're also going to specify flex wrap. So I'm just going to come and say flex wrap. In this case, I'm going to say wrap because we want, when we have items going to the end, then we want them on the next row. So I'm actually going to also specify a margin. So I'm actually going to say margin, and the margin is going to be, let's say, 15 pixels for every node. So when we save, we now see that our nodes are actually separated from each other. Let's go ahead and style each node. So when we style each node, what we're going to have is our title and our X to close that specific uh, actually delete that specific node. So I'm just going to come right here, and within our nodes we have things as a node header, a node title. So we're going to look into that. So the first thing I'm going to style is going to be our node header. So I'm just going to come and say dot node header, and within our node header I'm going to come and say that we're going to have a display of flex, and we shall have a justify content for space between. Actually, it's going to be space between, and now we have something like this. Now let's style up our node title. So I'm just going to come and say dot node title, and our node title in this case is going to have a font size. So let's actually style this up. So let's say font size of 20, and then let's make things a little bit different. So we shall give it a color. So I'm just going to give it a color of RGB that. So when I save, we have something like this. So I'm going to actually go ahead and also style this up, which is actually our close icon or our close anchor tag. So I'm just going to come and say dot close, and this is actually going to be I'm actually going to go ahead and give this a text decoration of none. It's actually going to be none. Shall also give it a color. This color is going to be our RGB. So when when I save this, you now see that we actually having this. Alright, so for now we are having our notes, but let's say we added a note that has longer text. So when I come right here in our guestbook API, I'm going to go ahead and create another note. So this note is going to have some longer text, just like we see here. It's also going to have a content that's somehow long, so I'll add that and just add some long content right here. So when I execute, it's going to go ahead and create our note. So when I come to our React app here and I refresh, we now have our note added. So our things are working well. So now let's look at how we can use our UI to create our notes. So when we actually inspect, there's something I want to do here. So we actually have some overflow here, and I'll have to first style this up. So for every note, we're going to have the overflow hidden. So I'm just going to say overflow. It's going to be hidden so that you don't have that extra text going beyond the node itself. So what you have here is we have our nodes, but they are not yet responsive, something that we're going to fix right now. So I'm just going to come to our media query right here, and what I'll do is to say that when you have width 700 pixels, we're going to have each node having a width. So I'm just going to come right here, and we are going to have a width, and this width is going to be let's say 80% of the entire screen. So I'll just come right here and say the each node will be 80%, so everything will be 80%. So when you come here, we actually have 80% of this. Now let's say we also need to style these things up so that we have this thing as responsive. So we actually have our node right here, which is working for now. Alright, so let's look at how we can now create our posts using our form. So to do that, what we're going to do is to basically create our post. So for now, we can log our title. So for example, if I created our title, so let's say our title, and let's say we created our content. This is our content. So for now, we can only log this in our console. For example, if I inspect and go to our console right here, we can be able to see this is our title and this is our content, and we actually have our IDs logging, which means we are calling our delete function even when we have not yet clicked. So what I'll do is to go to our note. Actually, it's within our index.js, and right here I have delete item ID. So to fix this, what I'll do is to basically make this a function that calls the delete item, provided the delete item ID. So when we have this, it's going to refresh, and now we can only have our post logged. Things are working. So each time we click on that, we log that specific ID of that specific node. So things are actually working the way we want. So let's go ahead and create a node. So for now, we can add a node, but when we add the title and the content, we actually just log them to the console. So what we need is to actually get this from our UI and then go ahead and basically post them to our database via our API. So I'm going to do this using the fetch API, just like I did for getting all the posts. So I'm going to go right here. So I'm just going to come, and what I'll do is to come within our create post, actually create node function. So I'm just going to come within here, and one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to still use the fetch API to basically create our new post. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to use the request class, or the request. I'm going to create a request object. So this request object will have all the information such as the URL and the method, the headers, and everything we're going to need. So I'll come and say const, and I'm going to call this a new request, and this request is going to be an instance or an object of type request. So when you have, actually it's going to be a new request. This is JavaScript. So when you have a new request, then we shall have to specify the values that are going to be in this new request. So it's going to take in the request information and everything about the request. So the first thing we're going to specify is the URL we're going to make a request to. I'm going to use these backticks. We already have our paste URL as localhost 8000. So I just come right here and say that we're going to make our request to localhost 8000 and slash, then we're going to make it to slash posts. Now another thing we're going to specify is going to be an object containing our request information or our request init. So in this case, we're going to provide that as our body. So the body is the data that we're going to send with this request. So the body is going to be JSON.stringify. So we need to actually stringify the data we're going to send with this request. And the data we're going to send is going to be an object. So this object is simply going to contain our title as well as our content. So when we have this, then we're also going to have our headers. So in the headers, so basically headers are just information about the request we are sending. So in this case, we are going to specify our content type. Now our content type basically describes which kind of data we're going to send this request. So I'm just going to come and specify that our content type, in this case, is going to be application stroke JSON. And once we have this thing, I'm going to go ahead and basically send this. So when we have this, we actually need to also specify our method, and I'm going to come and provide our method. So in this case, our method is actually going to be our post method. So right after having our new request, then we're going to use our fetch API to basically create this to create our we're going to use the fetch API to create our nodes. So I'm just going to make this function an asynchronous function. So I'm just going to come and say async, and when you have this, then you're just going to come and say that we shall have our response. So we're going to have const and then response, and this is going to be equal to await. Then we're going to fetch our new request. So basically the request class or the request class, or it's actually going to just help us to basically summarize everything that will give us an argument to our fetch API. So once we have this, then we need to await any data that comes back to us. So I'll just come and say const data, and this is actually going to be await, then response dot JSON. And once we have this, then we're going to check if the response is okay. So we shall say if response dot okay, then I'll simply console log any data that is brought back. So I'll say console.log any data, else we shall simply log failed network request or something like that. So I'll just come and say console.log, and this is going to be failed network request. Actually, it's going to be failed network request. Yeah, so let's actually try creating a post given this data we have. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new note. And one thing we have here is we can be able to submit this with empty fields. So to change this, I'm just simply going to go and make these form fields required. So I'll come right to our input right here, and I'll say we're going to have this as required. Then I also make our text area required. So I'll just come right here and say that this is also going to be required. So when I save this, so right now when we try adding a post, when we're going to try to create a post, so I'll create a title and content. So when I save this, we now see that our post has been created, and we can log this into the console. So for now, we're going to actually remove this console logs within our create post statement or our create post function. So we now see that we've created a post, but we haven't yet updated our UI. So right now we see our post has been created and our UI has only been updated when we actually refresh our page. But we need this UI to update each time we create a post. So to do that, I'll simply call our get all post function. Why? Because it gets all the posts from our API as well as to update the state of our posts. So I'll just come right here, and what I'll do is to set model visible to false, and then I'll call a get all posts function. So let's try to create another function, actually to create another post. So when I try to create a post, for example, this is a sample post. So when I create a sample post here, I can actually also say this is a sample post. So this is actually going to be our content. So when I save, right now we see that our UI has instantly been updated. So right now we have some progress. So let's go ahead and actually look at how we can delete our posts. So to delete our post, what we need is to click this button, keep track of the ID of that specific post, and then we're going to use our fetch API to delete that post and update our UI. Simple. So I'm just going to come right here and I'm going to go to our delete a post. Actually, we have one for deleting a post. Now we're going to do the same thing right here. What we want is to delete a post with that ID. So when you go back to our documentation right here, what you have is a route for deleting that post. So I'm just going to come right here and make a request to /post/id. So I'm just going to do that from here. So in this case, we're just going to say const. Actually, we shall also make this an async function. So I'm just going to come and say async function. And once we have this, I'm just going to say const response. So response is actually going to be await, then fetch, then all we need to do is to fetch our base URL. So we need to fetch our base URL. So it's actually going to be our base URL, and then slash posts, and then slash the ID of the post we want to delete. So I'm just going to use this syntax, and I'll pass in the node ID. So when you pass in the node ID, then we're actually going to specify our method to be delete. So I'll just come right here, I'll provide our request init and our request info. So in here I'll just provide our method, and in this case the method is actually going to be delete. Now we don't expect this to return anything. It's actually going to return 204, no content. So when you don't expect it, then what we're going to do is to actually get all posts to update our UI. So I'm just going to say get all posts. So when you have this executed, now let's actually console log. I'll actually just console.log. Actually, let's say let me just say if response to okay. For now, I'm just simply going to console log our response dot status. So when I save this, we're now going to look into this. So when you come right on our React frontend right here, when you try to delete a post, so let's say we're deleting this sample post, we now see that it's actually being deleted. So when you delete this, we actually see it's being deleted and our UI is now being updated. So I'm just going to delete all of our posts, and you now see that we currently have no post. So let's try adding a post. So when I add a new title, and then let's say we're going to add a new content. When I save this, you now see that our new title and new content have been created. So in this video, I've been showing you how you can build a basic app with ReactJS and Django REST Framework backend. Thank you for watching, and if you found this useful, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new to this channel, because I'll be creating videos like this in the coming future. Thank you for watching, guys. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you in the next video. Bye.